Hi, welcome to the introductory video. In this, we will discuss critical reasoning, especially the introduction to critical reasoning. We will discuss an aspect of critical reasoning called the argument and assumption based questions. We will look at this in context of GRE and GMAT, although there are some differences between the two. The theory or the way in which it is tested and the question and the reasoning tested on these tests is almost identical, and therefore this will be a good starting point for critical reasoning in either GRE or GMAT. So how does this question look? Well, this question will look sort of like a reading comprehension question in that it has a passage, it has a question, and it has answer options. Some pivotal differences is that in reading comprehension, the passage tends to be in the left side of the screen, while the questions and the answers tend to be in the right side. Although, when it comes to critical reasoning, your question and the passage and the answer options flow as seen on the screen. So that's one way to identify that. Also, by reading the question stem, it becomes very obvious what type of question this is. So critical reasoning questions will ask you for things such as assumptions, to strengthen, weaken, to evaluate, or analyze the structure of the bold statement, and so on. So knowing those question types is also helpful in identifying that it is a critical reasoning question. Now, how is this different from a reading comprehension passage? Well, unlike reading comprehension, where you're supposed to answer based on data provided and inferences that you can make, in critical reasoning, you're required to make logical reasoning and logical analysis of the data provided, and also with respect to the conclusions given in the argument itself. Again, what these mean, what an argument is, what a conclusion and evidence is, we will discuss in a bit. So to look at it from a structural point of view, there are three aspects or three features in a critical reasoning question. There's a stimulus, there's a question stem, and there is the answer options. Now, typically a student would dive into the stimulus, read the stimulus, come to the question, go back to the stimulus, and then go to the answers, right? Very counterintuitively, someone might end up going from the answers to the passage or the stimulus, which will be disastrous. So why not start with the stimulus? Well, one reason is that there is only going to be one question attached to each stimulus in critical reasoning. And these questions are going to be very, very laser focused on what they require from you. And again, remember, these are not going to be detail based. Rather, these are based on logical analysis of the data provided. So you can't just go back to the passage and find a line that works for the answer option. That does not work here. Instead, you will have to read the text in a very strategic way, in a critical way, so that you understand the focus in the first go itself. So for that, the first thing that you need to do is read the question stem first, so that you know exactly what is required, and you go to the stimulus with that exact expectation of what is required. This gives you a very clear laser focus. This will also help you be very accurate and very fast in solving critical reasoning, right? So now that that's out of the way, let's look at what our method for these question types would be. Irrespective of the question type, the method is going to be the same for critical reasoning. So step one is to identify the question type, read the question stem and understand what exactly is the question expecting from us. What does it want us to analyze? The next step would be to break down the stimulus. So depending on the question stem, the stimulus could be either an argument or just a bunch of data, or a combination of multiple arguments, right? And you may be expected to find different things. So based on the question, you will have to break down the stimulus to the core functions. Again, this and what to break it down into, we will discuss in the following sessions. But although it might seem like a lot of things to do, it is quite simple once you understand the different kinds of questions and what is expected of them. Once you figure that out, once you break down the stimulus, now you have enough data to make a prediction relevant to the question type itself. And once you've made the prediction, the last step is evaluating the options. Remember, your job is not to find an answer option that looks good. Rather, your job is to eliminate, or rather evaluate and eliminate as many of the answer options as you can, which do not fit with the prediction or the scope of the stimulus in itself. And once you're done with that, You can evaluate whatever is remaining and select the most appropriate of that which remains. Again, how this makes sense and how this flows through, we will see with examples in the next few minutes. So looking at step one, the question types. What are the question types? Well, you can broadly classify them into three buckets of questions. Bucket one is assumption-based questions, bucket two is evidence-based questions, and bucket three is structure-based questions. Assumption-based questions are based on something called an argument. In other words, your stimulus is an argument in assumption-based question types. What does that mean? We will talk about that shortly. So these assumption-based questions expect you to find something called an assumption from the argument or the stimulus in this case. And this question type forms about 70% of all the questions you'll see in critical reasoning. So that's a huge chunk, right? So the skills required for this is very, very essential for all these questions. And also it's essential for the AWA, the analytical writing assessment, the argument-based essay essentially. It's the same scales of evaluation that you will be using here as you would be on the essays. Evidence-based questions don't really have an assumption. Rather, you're bothered about the data and what inferences or what explanations can be derived out of them. Inference question, by the way, is a huge portion of CR, the remaining portion. It forms about 25 to 30% of the remaining questions, essentially meaning the other two question types are rare at best. Also remember that inference questions are found in reading comprehension as well. The skills involved and the strategies involved are very, very similar for both critical reasoning and reading comprehension. The other two question types we will discuss about when the time comes. They are rare, and when they do come, they're easy to crack once you understand what the strategy and method for solving them is. Now that we've established that the major part of critical reasoning is assumption based, let's dive a little deeper into this assumption based question. Right? So let's look at what are assumptions. More importantly, what is this thing called an argument? Remember, I spoke about how the stimulus in assumption based questions is going to be an argument, right? So what does this word argument mean? In everyday usage, an argument is a disagreement between two people. When two people have a fight, we call it an argument. But do you really think GRE is bothered about such arguments? Definitely not. Instead, an argument on the GRE is usually an opinion or a claim that's based on some reasoning, right? So when you say that someone makes a good argument, you're saying that he or she makes a good point based on some solid reasoning points. So take a look at this. Is this an argument? Small cars are better than big cars. When you look at it, you realize that it's a statement, not really an argument. Take a look at this instead. Small cars give much better fuel economy compared to big cars. Therefore, small cars are better than big cars. Now, the author does make the point that small cars are better than big cars, but he uses a reasoning point that small cars give much better fuel economy compared to big cars. Now, because this claim is supported by an evidence or a reasoning, this can be classified as an argument. And this is what GRE deals with, and this is what GMAT deals with every time it discusses or it brings about the word argument, or it gives you a stimulus that is an argument. To rephrase, an argument in critical reasoning is a claim, suggestion, prediction, or plan made based on some evidence or reasoning. So, now we know what an argument looks like and what is required for an argument to be called an argument. Yes, and bringing back that example, we realize that it is an argument. It falls into the criteria of what is called an argument, but is it really a good argument? Is it an argument that you would necessarily agree with? So let's evaluate it. So if I told you that small cars are better than big cars because small cars give much better mileage, are you inclined to agree with me wholeheartedly? Think about that for a second. The answer probably is that no, you don't necessarily agree with me, right? And why would that be? Why do you think that you would not agree with me? Think about that. Why? What would you say, or how would you rebut my point that small cars are better than big cars? So one of the points you'd probably make is that, for me, A car being better means that it is cheaper, or that it is more, more luxurious, or it can do really fast speeds, or it can do interstate travel, right? So all these criteria is what is good or better in my regard. And you would say, no, when you say that small cars are better than big cars, you sort of discount all those points and you completely ignore those points. And essentially what you've done is you've noticed the problems or the gap in logic in the argument and sort of deflated my point. So what you'll also realize is that in every argument where there's an evidence and a conclusion is based on this evidence, there is going to be a gap in reasoning. Just as in here, where there's a gap in reasoning because the author assumes that better fuel economy is the only thing that defines a car to be better. And this leads me to the assumption that the author is making. So think about it, when the author says that smaller cars are better than bigger cars, he is assuming or taking for granted that if a car has better fuel economy, then it's definitely better. Or in other words, there is nothing else to be considered when thinking about a car to be better than another car except for fuel economy, right? That only fuel economy matters. So what we essentially found is that the evidence gives us the conclusion, but it doesn't really make sense most of the time. Even the best, most good sounding arguments will have gaps. Now this gap is filled by this boldened part, which is the assumption. The assumption is the stuff that the author takes for granted. He never states it. It's never stated in the argument, but its role is to fill in the gaps. Just as in the previous argument, the gap was that there could be other reasons or other criterias that make a car better, and the author actually assumes or takes for granted that there is no such thing, no other constraints or no other prerequisites that make something better. You realize that the assumption comes in and fills the gap and makes everything better. So evidence along with the assumption essentially will give rise to a conclusion, right? So if you found out that the evidence is attached with an assumption that is 100% true, then the conclusion will also be 100% true. But on GMAT and GRE, you can never prove that the assumption is 100% true, right? The assumption is the assumption, it's never stated. Our job is to work with the assumption. So if you have to weaken or strengthen or evaluate the argument, you will have to do it by attacking or supporting the assumption. So now that we've established that assumptions are very important and what essentially assumptions are, let's see how we can get that assumption. Because obviously if you need to work with the assumption, we need to first figure out how to objectively find the assumption in every question of CR that we come across. So the first thing that you will have to do is find the conclusion. The conclusion, like I stated before, is the point or the prediction or the suggestion that the author makes. Now this can be identified in three ways. One of the easiest ways is to read the question carefully. Many of the questions, not most, but many of the questions will address the conclusion in the question itself. For instance, a question might say, which of the following answers strengthens the conclusion or strengthens the argument that taxes has to be raised? Now the conclusion, therefore, we realize is that taxes have to be raised. So many questions will point at what the conclusion is. Another way to look at it is in the stimulus, look for keywords. Keywords such as therefore, hence, in conclusion, clearly. All these words are indicative of a conclusion. So the sentence following these indicator words or keywords will be the conclusion of the argument. Again, it's important that once you've identified it, you take some time to assimilate it and then paraphrase it in your own words. Because if you don't really understand the core of what he's trying to say, you will not be able to break the argument. Yes? If you're not able to find the conclusion from the question or through keywords, the third way and the most reliable way, in fact, is to use something called the one-liner test. So what this means is that you read the argument and then you force yourself to write the entire argument, or rather paraphrase the entire argument in just one line. Now, I promise that the one line that you've paraphrased, if you've gotten the gist, if you've gotten the core of the argument, will be the conclusion. Because remember, the conclusion is the point of the argument, it is the reason the argument exists, and is the it's essentially the point that the author is trying to make. So if you're able to find that, you'll realize that that is, in a sense, is the conclusion of the argument. Once you've found the conclusion, it's very simple to find the evidence. The evidence is statistics, data, or any kind of reasoning that is used to support or back the conclusion, right? Again, make sure you paraphrase the evidence so that it is very clear as to what data he provides, and when you compare that to the conclusion, you'll know what data is not provided, and as a result, what assumptions he is making. So let's look at an example. In this, take a minute to read it, and once you've done reading it, paraphrase the conclusion and evidence. You can pause the video if required. So here's the conclusion and here's the evidence. So the point of the argument is that air travel is becoming more dangerous. The evidence, of course, is a statistic saying that more people have died, about over 700 deaths have happened, and this is many more collisions than it has had before. Great. We will come back to this argument in a bit, but let me take you to the next stage of breaking down the stimulus. So we found the conclusion, we found the evidence, and once you've done that, once you've paraphrased both of those, the next step is to compare them and hunt for problems. Now, why hunt for problems? Well, remember that the assumption's role is to fix a problem in the argument. Well, it's very easy to find the assumption if you can intuitively find the problem in the argument in itself. And we are usually much better at finding issues with an argument rather than finding out what the assumption or presupposition that the author makes inherently, right? So how do you do that? Well, compare the conclusion with the evidence and ask yourself, what are the things, what are the words, and what are the ideas that the author has linked between the conclusion and evidence which may not be supportable, which may be questionable. Again, we will see examples of this in a bit, but by comparing that and questioning the links between the evidence and the conclusion, it will become very clear what the problem with the argument is. And the assumption comes in to fix that problem. So let's look at the example again. The conclusion was air travel is becoming increasingly more dangerous. The evidence was that in the last year there have been 700 deaths. Now, if you notice, the argument here talks about air travel becoming more dangerous, but the evidence only talks about collisions, how there are more number of deaths, right? And the problem here is just because the number of deaths increased doesn't necessarily mean that something has become more dangerous. For instance, if I look at statistics, and let's just say that there are 10 people every year that die because of shark attacks, right? And about 1,000 people or 10,000 people die because of traffic accidents. Based on this data, do you think it's reasonable if I said that cars are therefore more dangerous than sharks? When you hear that argument, you realize something is off, right? You realize that this does not make sense. And the reason is that the argument there does not take into account the total number of people who interact with sharks versus the total number of people who interact with cars. So if we found out that about 1 billion people drive cars and only 10 people swim with sharks, you realize that sharks are way more dangerous than cars can ever be. So the problem here again is that just because something has more number of deaths doesn't necessarily mean it's more dangerous. So it is very likely that the number of airlines or number of flights that are going out has increased. So the number of people traveling by air has increased dramatically, and this could be why the deaths has increased. And this need not be an indicator that it's becoming more dangerous. In fact, it could mean that it is becoming more safe, in fact, if the number of people traveling overall has increased substantially. So to revisit, the problematic link is that he makes a link between increase in death with becoming more dangerous. The assumption, therefore, to fix this is that the only determinant for something to be more dangerous is the number of deaths. Or in other words, total number of deaths is enough to determine the dangerousness of something. Make sense? Yeah? So to recap, conclusion you find either by looking at the question, at the keyword, or the one-line test. Once you figure out the conclusion, paraphrase the evidence, compare those two, question every link that exists, question every unsupportable link that exists, and that will lead you to the problem in the argument. Once you figure out the problem, it's very simple to figure out the assumption. Yeah, so it might seem like a lengthy process, but once you get used to this, once you get in the habit of looking at it through these critical reasoning perspectives, you'll realize that it becomes sort of spontaneous and second nature for you to question the links and look at the unsupportable details within the conclusion and evidence. So let's take a look at an example. Go through the argument, paraphrase the conclusion, and paraphrase the evidence. Once done, we will discuss the assumption. You can take a chance at figuring out the problem and the assumption as well. You may want to pause the video now and then continue once you're done. Okay, so assuming that we've already completed, paraphrased the argument, let's look at the argument in itself. So it says, over past 5 years, some businesses located in A have moved manufacturing or assembly operations to B. So companies move from A to B. But there is a new change that says that the per hour wages in A is going to become approximately same with B. Or in other words, B's per hour wage is going to be raised to that of A. And based on this, the author says, he says, therefore, and that's a good indicator that it's a conclusion. If the change were to come into effect, very few businesses in country A would move manufacturing to assembly operations to country B. So looking at the details again, the author says very few businesses will move from A to B. Evidence is that minimum wage per hour is becoming more or less the same. So the link, or the unquestionable, unsupportable link here is between the minimum wage and move from A to B. Think about it. Do you think a business will only move from one country to another because you get cheap labor? Or do you think there could be other reasons for this as well? It's very possible that there could be other reasons, right? Perhaps the demographics is much more relevant to the target audience, or there's raw materials that they can't get anywhere else, or there's skilled labor that they can't get anywhere else. And these could be reasons why the industries are moving from A to B. The author, on the other hand, chooses not to look at those criteria and only looks at this one particular criteria about minimum wage per hour. This, of course, doesn't mean that his argument is not right, but it's very possible that it's not, because he's not paid attention to the other possibilities that could exist. So what do you think he's assuming? Well, he's assuming that minimum wage per hour is the only consideration that these businesses have when they move from A to B. Make sense? Or in other words, there are no other considerations that they take into account when they move from A to B. Let's look at another example. Again, go through the same process. Once you've jotted another conclusion, evidence, and the assumption, you can unpause the video. Okay, so the conclusion here is indicated by clearly, it says that if you take one portion of Slim Up every day for 3 months, you will lose weight. And this is based on a study. The evidence is essentially a study. And if you were a careful read, you would have noticed something very, very suspicious about the difference in the study and what the author says. So in the study, they took the artificial supplement for 3 months, but you also realize that they took it every morning after exercise. And this is the detail that's very, very important. Remember, just because it seems like an unimportant thing when he talks about it doesn't necessarily mean it isn't. It's very likely that the people lost the weight because of exercise, right? So looking at the details, conclusion is that Slim Up is the cause for weight loss. The evidence is that Slim Up plus exercise in that study resulted in weight loss. So think about it, when the evidence suggests that there was exercise involved, and the author says that Slim Up alone will give you weight loss, what do you think is the assumption about exercise? Well, essentially the assumption being made is that exercise has no effect on weight loss. Makes sense? That it is zero, that it's null, that it has no effect whatsoever. That said, let's look at it in a question context. It's the same argument. The question is, which of the following is the assumption? So we've already predicted that. So we've done most of the hard work. Let's go to the answer options and decide, or rather evaluate each of the answer options and figure out how they make sense. Let's look at A. No other dietary supplement will have the same effect on overweight men. So look at that. The answer option is about other dietary supplements, right? Our conclusion is only about Slim Up. And therefore, because it's not about slim up, this is eliminated because it's out of scope. B, the men in the study, it says, will gain back the weight if they discontinue slim up program. Remember, the conclusion is about people in general. It's not about the men in the study. Because of that, B is also out. It's also out of scope. There's no point talking about the men in the study because that is a data and our conclusion is not bothered about it. C, overweight men will achieve only partial weight loss if they don't remain on the slim up program for a full 3 months. Now, on cursory view, it sounds like, okay, this could work. It sounds weird enough to be possibly the right answer. Let me keep this. We will come back to this and evaluate it a little closer. Let's not waste too much time on justifying it. D, the daily exercise regime was not responsible for the effects noted in the study. This is essentially what our prediction was. Great job. So the conclusion was about slim up and its efficacy, and option D directly addresses the gap between the conclusion and evidence. So therefore, it's very, very relevant and it's very precise to our prediction as well. So D is most probably the right answer. E, women won't experience similar weight reduction if they adhere to the slim up program. Now, the problem is it's not a debate of whether men versus women. The conclusion talking about people in general. And E, therefore, does not have any bearing on the relevance of the conclusion. Going back to C, it says overweight men will achieve only partial weight loss if they do not remain on the slim up program for a full 3 months. Now think about this. What does partial weight loss mean? Does it mean 10%? Does it mean 99%? Does it mean 1%? We have no idea, right? The word partial weight loss could mean anything. Also, it says if they do not remain on the slim up program for the full 3 months. What is this not remaining on the program for the full 3 months mean? Does that mean that they've only been in the program for 1 month, 30 days, 89 days? We have no idea. So this answer can be construed in various ways, and based on those various ways, our results may vary as well. We need to justify this answer to make it right. And always avoid such answer options because this answer option is very, very vague, right? Avoid vague answer options. On critical reasoning, the answer options will usually be very, very, very precise and to the point, just as D was. So D is the right answer. And again, by evaluating the differences in the answer option and by evaluating the details of the answers, it becomes very, very obvious which of the answer options are correct and which of the answer options are definitely not possible. Yeah, so that's a quick introduction into critical reasoning, into assumption-based questions. Of course, this is not the end of it. There's a lot more into assumptions, and there are strategies related to finding assumptions, but this is sort of the tip of the iceberg, and this will give you a taste of what critical reasoning questions in GRE and GMAT look like, and the kind of reasoning skills and the kind of thinking skills that you require to be effective on this question type. So again, remember, although it might seem a little inflated in difficulty, or it may seem a little challenging for you, do know that with constant practice and with strategic practice, solving critical reasoning questions becomes sort of second nature. But that's essentially why the training program is required, that a sort of behavior is set in and you're disciplined in the way you approach questions and you look at data and how you deal with answer options as well. So I hope you had an informative session. I'll see you all very soon.